Interfaith, as those of you who've been coming know, is a really important initiative of the Bernardine Center dedicated to furthering our efforts at interreligious dialogue, and in so doing to strengthen our relationships and deepen our understanding among Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and especially leaders in the Chicago area. As we do every year, this year we gave our participants an opportunity to evaluate last year's program in order to assist us in our planning for this year. And overall, the feedback was very positive. The topics and the speakers received very high marks, and a number of people commented on the sense of hospitality and friendliness. Among the suggestions for moving forward, participants indicated that they were interested in the topic of the environment, in social justice issues, and in focusing one of our evenings on the role of Abraham in each of our traditions. Based on one or two comments, our committee also discussed the methods we have used for feedback from the participants after our table discussions. The kind of loose reporting back style that we were using doesn't seem to be the most satisfactory method. So for this evening, and if it works well for all of our subsequent gatherings as well, we propose at the conclusion of our table discussion to give you an opportunity at your tables to name possible outcomes of your discussion that might be helpful or useful in your position, in your ministry, in your daily life, whatever. And then as time allows, we'll have an opportunity to share with the larger group at the end. We really appreciate that you took the time as participants to share your reflections with us, and we definitely take them very seriously when we do our planning. And case in point, our topic for this evening is, who is Abraham anyway? Does Abraham unite or divide Jews, Christians, and Muslims? We commonly, and usually with the best intentions, refer to our three religions as Abrahamic, often under the assumption that the figure of Abraham is common to our three traditions. But is this really true? The historical record seems to suggest that Abraham has been used more for the purposes of identity contestation among the three religions rather than to unite them in mutual respect, understanding, and cooperation. What does this record mean for us today? Do we ignore it? Should we ignore it? If we do so, what impact does that have on us as people committed to dialogue? To address these questions, we have three wonderful panelists this evening. The first is Jay Moses. Where's Jay? The pastor of Congregational Ministries in Wheaton. Dr. Jay Moses is a native of California and comes from an ecumenical past and has been a Presbyterian since first being invited to a Presbyterian youth group in high school. A sixth-generation minister in his family, he has been active in full-time ministry for the last 18 years. He served at Bethany Church of West Covina and at Good Shepherd Presbyterian Church in Los Alamitos before being ordained to the PCUSA as a minister of Word and Sacrament at the First Presbyterian Church of Redlands in 2001. Jay has been a pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Wheaton since May of 2004, with his main ministry emphases being in the areas of education, mission, and Christian hospitality. He strives to remind others of their roots in discipleship while pushing them to see outside their perspective of privilege as North American Christians. Jay has been very active in the areas of reconciliation and peacemaking with a focus on international missions, Israel, Latin America, interfaith activities, and ecumenical work with the ELCA and the UCC denominations. He has served on the Ecumenical and Interfaith Work Group of the Chicago Presbytery since 2004, and more recently serves as the Muslim coordinator for Chicagoland Presbyterians. He earned his Master's of Divinity degree in Christian Origins from Fuller Theological Seminary, and in 2009 obtained his doctorate in ministry from Northern Seminary. Specializing in ancient liturgy and modern worship, his thesis involved children's liturgical worship, enacting the story of God with our children. While completing the requirements for authorization in ministry within the United Church of Christ, Jay considers himself a Catholic Reformed Evangelical, but mainly another pilgrim on the way of the crucified one. So welcome, Jay. David Fox Sandmel is our next speaker. David Sandmel is no stranger to all of us here at CTU, being part of our faculty. He's the Crown Ryan Professor of Jewish Studies here at CTU and the Rabbi Educator at Temple Shalom in Chicago. He also serves as Senior Advisor on Interreligious Affairs to the Religious Action Center and Adjunct Faculty at the Union for Reform Judaism. From 1998 to 2001, he was the Jewish Scholar at the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. There, he directed the National Jewish Scholars Project, a major initiative to promote a new discussion within the Jewish community and between Jews and Christians about the differences and similarities between the two traditions. As part of the project, Rabbi Sandmel coordinated the publication of Dabru Emet, a Jewish statement on Christians and Christianity, and a groundbreaking event that generated international attention in the interfaith community and wide media coverage. He is the co-editor of Christianity in Jewish Terms, to which he has also contributed an essay. In addition, he is the lead editor of Irreconcilable Differences, a learning resource for Jews and Christians. And the irreconcilable differences is a question. Irreconcilable differences.
I would have it as an explanation.
Okay. At any rate, it's a study and discussion guide that focuses on core theological issues on the boundary between Judaism and Christianity. Rabbi Sandmel teaches a course here at CTU with Professor Scott Alexander and Dr. Ghulam Asi, Dr. Asi. Oh, Inam al-Haq, excuse me. I'm sorry. He lectures widely on contemporary issues in Jewish-Christian relations, Jewish-Muslim relations, religion in contemporary society, and the foundations of Judaism and Christianity in antiquity. He chairs the Committee on Interfaith Activities of the Central Conference of American Rabbis and is the CCAR representative to the joint UAHC-CCAR Commission on Interfaith Relations, the National Council of Synagogues, and the International Jewish Committee on Interfaith Consultations. He received his bachelor's degree from Ohio State University and was ordained at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati. He completed his doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, the Association for Jewish Studies, and the Central Conference of American Rabbis. So welcome, Rabbi Sandmel. Professor Abbas Barzegar is an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies and faculty associate at the Middle East Institute at Georgia State University. He's also a fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Professor Barzegar received his BA and MA degrees from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and he earned his PhD from the Graduate Division of Religion at Emory University. The topic of his dissertation was Historical Narrative in the Formation of Sunni Islam. Professor Barzegar has published an edited volume with Richard Martin entitled Islamism, Competing Perspectives on Political Islam. This volume was published by Stanford University Press. He's written numerous articles such as The Spirituality of Prophetic Traditions, Discourse, Identity, and Community, Problems and Prospects in the Study of Islam in America, and Latino Muslims in the United States, an introduction in the Journal of the High Plains Society for Applied Anthropologists. We are delighted this evening to have these distinguished scholars and practitioners with us as our panel members. So again, let's welcome them. So each of the panelists will have 20 minutes for their presentation, after which we will move into our discussion. So I would invite the panelists to come forward and be seated up here.
Well, good evening. Just before dinner, we flipped a 3-sided coin, and I decided to kick off. So, I wanted to address a few things this evening, and what I want to suggest is that broadly, Abraham is both a uniting and a dividing figure. And I think both of these are actually good. Interreligious relations is about both commonalities and differences. Commonalities are important for establishing connection and for building bridges, especially when there is a history of distrust or enmity. But focusing only on the commonalities can obscure essential and defining characteristics of the other. It's really in our differences that we get to know the other as the other understands themselves. So, for example, we often say that Jews, Christians, and Muslims worship the same God. Okay, well and good. But Jews, Christians, and Muslims have very different ideas about the nature of God, what God has done, and how God has revealed God's self to human beings. And unless we examine those differences, we're going to be left with a shallow and, I would say, in many ways, a distorted understanding of our brothers and sisters from other traditions. So the same can be said about Abraham. While it's true that Jews, Christians, and Muslims all revere the figure of Abraham, I think what we're going to discover this evening is that there are, at the very least, 4 different Abrahams. Okay? The first of these is the Abraham that's found in the book of Genesis, which is scriptural for Jews and for Christians, but not in the same way, certainly, if scriptural at all, for Muslims. Then there's the Abraham of the Jewish tradition, the Abraham of the Christian tradition, and the Abraham of the Muslim tradition. And while there are going to be some overlaps and some similarities, there are also going to be specific characteristics that make each of those Abrahams unique. My task this evening is to present the Jewish Abraham, but in order to do so, I have to make a few comments about the Abraham of Genesis and the relationship of the Jewish tradition to the book of Genesis. So there is a great deal about the Jewish Abraham that one cannot find in the book of Genesis. Genesis is the first book of the Pentateuch, what we Jews consider to be the Torah, or more precisely for what I'm talking about right now, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Torah Shebichtav, the written Torah. But we Jews also have what we consider to be the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. Jewish tradition teaches that Moses received both the written and the oral Torah on Mount Sinai. And they are part of a unified, inseparable whole, though we certainly tend to, we privilege traditionally the written Torah, but for the sake of shorthand, given my limited time here, I was given 20 minutes to talk, and I know that Sheila has a hook, and at 20 minutes and 1 second, I'm out of here. So The oral Torah consists of the traditions of the rabbis as found in the classic rabbinic literature, in the Midrash, in the Mishnah, in the Talmud. And it is through these that we Jews understand what is written in the written Torah. Okay? And I think that we'll find some commonalities in the Christian tradition in the relationship to Genesis and what Christians find in the New Testament and in subsequent Christian interpretations of both the New and the Christian Old Testament. Indeed, when Jews sit to study Torah together, they will study often from a book that has both the Pentateuch, the written Torah, and then written around the outside of that text. I realize I'm talking about a written oral Torah. That's a little confusing, but just bear with me. The oral Torah as well. So it is through that lens of the oral tradition that the Jews understand what is written in the Torah in general, in the book of Genesis more specifically, and again for us this evening, how we come to know the figure of Abraham. When it comes to Abraham, then, while we find the central narrative about Abraham in Genesis, the Jewish Abraham will only really fully emerge in rabbinic traditions about him. And basically, that's what I want to spend the rest of my time on. I want to focus on some rabbinic traditions about Abraham. And I see some of you have already gotten it out, the lovely, thank you, Janet, the lovely lavender insert in your folder has some texts that I'm going to be referring to as we go through this. So in the book of Genesis, we first encounter Abraham in chapter 11, when he's mentioned in a genealogical table as being the son of Terach. And that's really all we learn about him there. In the very next chapter, Abraham is called by God to locate to the land that God will show him, the land of Canaan. Genesis tells us nothing of Abraham's early life or why God chose him. And you know, you give a rabbi an opportunity like that with absolutely no information, you know they're going to jump in and provide lots of commentary. And the oral Torah, the rabbinic tradition, fills in this lacuna. Abraham's birth, we learn, is a wondrous birth. It was prophesied to the wicked king Nimrod, who seeks to kill him. So his parents hide him in a cave where he's nurtured by the angel Gabriel. As a mere toddler, he's just a regular run-of-the-mill, overachieving Jewish boy. He intuits through his observation of the sun and the moon that there can be only one God who has created heaven and earth. And let's take a look at text number 1 on the handout. This is from the great collection of Midrashic literature edited by Louis Ginsberg called The Legends of the Jews. If you're interested in the precise sources, I suggest you go to that volume, and which is, I think, 4 volumes of text and 3 volumes of footnotes. So, thus Abraham was deserted in the cave without a nurse, and he began to wail. God sent Gabriel down to give him milk to drink, and the angel made it flow from the little finger of the baby's right hand, and he sucked at it until he was 10 days old. Then he arose and walked about and left the cave and went along the edge of the valley. When the sun sank and the stars came forth, he said, "These are the gods." But when the dawn came and the stars could be seen no longer, and then he said, "I will not pay worship to these, for they are no gods." Thereupon the sun came forth, and he spoke, "This is my God, him I will extol." But again the sun set, and he said, "He is no God." And beholding the moon, he called her his God, to whom he would pay divine homage, or homage. The moon was obscured, and he cried out, "This too is no God. There is one who sets them all in motion." So at the ripe old age of 10, Abraham is already arguing, offering us the argument by design, and he has become a convinced monotheist. Now, Abraham not only becomes a monotheist, but he becomes a missionary of the one God. And if you take a look at our second text, it says that, and Haran died in the presence of his father Terach. This is a quote from Genesis 11, verse 28. Rabbi Wheaton said, Terach was a manufacturer of idols. When I tell this story, I like to say he had the Idols Are Us concession at the Mall of Ur. He once went away somewhere and left Abraham to sell them in his place. A man came and wished to buy one. How old are you? Abraham asked him. 50 years was the reply. Woe to such a man, he exclaimed. You are 50 years old and would worship a day-old object. At this he became ashamed and departed. On another occasion, a woman came with a plate full of flour and requested him, take this and offer it to them, that is, to these idols. So he took a stick, broke them, and put the stick in the hand of the largest. When his father returned, he demanded, what have you done to them? My whole inventory for the holiday season has been destroyed. I cannot conceal it from you, he said, long before someone else said, I cannot tell a lie. A woman came with a plate full of fine meal and requested me to offer it to them. One claimed, I must eat first, while the other claimed, I must eat first. Thereupon the largest one arose, took the stick, and broke them. Why do you make sport of me? His father called out to him. Have they any knowledge? Should not your ears listen to what your mouth is saying? He retorted. So Abraham here is convincing his father that his father should become a believer in the one God, and he's convincing all these other folks. There are lots of stories about Abraham and his missionary activity, and indeed, Abraham and Sarah are seen as the model of people who bring potential proselytes under the wings of the Shekhinah, as the text says. Indeed, when someone becomes a Jew by choice, converts to Judaism, they take a Hebrew name as so-and-so, the son or daughter of Abraham and Sarah. Now, the rabbinic tradition adds a great deal of detail to the rest of the Abraham cycle in Genesis. Abraham observes the written and the oral Torah. This is quite fascinating since Abraham is in Genesis, and the revelation at Sinai doesn't come till Exodus. So there's a certain issue of chronology here. But just like Abraham was able to nurture himself miraculously through his finger, you'll see if we turn to text 3 that he's also, in a sense, an autodidact when it comes to Torah. He figured it out himself, and again, not only the written but the oral Torah. So where did Abraham learn Torah? Rabbi Levi said he learned Torah of himself. He just kind of intuited it. For it says, the dissembler in his heart, pardon the typos here, the dissembler in his heart shall have his fill of his own ways, and a good man, or perhaps but a good man, shall be satisfied in himself. Rabbi Samuel Bar Nachmani and Rabbi Jonah ben Elazar the Catalan said, our father Abraham even knew of the Eruv Tavshilin. Now, I'll take 20 minutes to explain this for you. Suffice it to say that this is a rabbinic law that enables someone to cook goods for the Sabbath, food for the Sabbath, if the preceding 2 days have been a festival on which one generally is not allowed to cook. Okay? If you want to find out more information about this, you can ask me later, or of course Rabbi Belinsky as well can fill you in on this. The point of this is that this is nowhere mentioned in Torah. It is a rabbinic tradition. And so our father Abraham knew about this, for it says in Genesis 26:5, because Abraham hearkened to my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my laws, and my teaching. And you'll see in the text there I've put the translation of the word teachings, which is Torotai. That is the plural of Torah. 2 Torahs, 2 Torot. a written Torah, and an oral Torah. Abraham learned them all. There are also passages in which he sits in the academy and studies halakha. He gives tithes, we are told. He prays. He travels to the site where the temple will eventually be built. All of this, of course, in anticipation. Though Abraham, I don't believe that Abraham is ever called Rabbi Abraham in the tradition. Unlike Moses, who was Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our rabbi, he certainly behaves like an exemplary rabbinic Jew. He's a great sage. He behaves with great courtesy and especially hospitality. At the end of chapter 17 of Genesis, Abraham is commanded to circumcise himself and all the males in his household. At the beginning of chapter 18, we find Abraham is sitting at the opening of the tent because the day is warm, and when he sees 3 men approaching, who later we learn are angels, he runs to greet them and welcomes them into his home by washing their feet and feeding them. He asks Sarah to prepare the food. We can get into that another time. We learn from the rabbis, however, that Abraham was sitting in the door of the tent because he was still recuperating from his operation. But nonetheless, this did not prevent him from getting up and running to greet his guests. Indeed, Abraham becomes the example par excellence of the mitzvah, the divine commandment of hachnasat orchim, of welcoming guests. And we learn that his tent was open on all 4 sides so that he could see people coming from all directions and make them feel welcome. In the Mishnah, we find in one list of sort of a brief list of essential commandments that welcoming the guest is one of them. Thus, Abraham is a model in general of what a good Jew should be, one who studies Torah, who observes the commandments meticulously, who goes above and beyond the letter of the law to demonstrate derech eretz, basic human decency. But Abraham is more than just a model for Jews. His righteousness yields rewards not only for himself, but also for his offspring. What he did stands his descendants in good stead. This is expressed in the concept of zechut avot, the merit of the ancestors. We may be of little merit, but God will extend mercy to us because of the righteousness of our ancestors, specifically Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. No act of Abraham provides more merit for his descendants than his willingness to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, as found in Genesis 22, known in the Jewish tradition as Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. This event is recalled each year during the Jewish Days of Awe, the period of reflection and repentance that begins on the new year, on Rosh Hashanah, and ends 10 days later on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Genesis 22 is read traditionally in the synagogue on the 2nd day of Rosh Hashanah, and the distinguishing ritual of both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is the blowing of the shofar, the ram's horn. Though the connection between the shofar and Rosh Hashanah is explicit in the Torah, Rosh Hashanah is called a day of the sounding of the horn, the connection of the ram's horn to the ram substituted for Isaac on the mountain in Genesis 22 at the last moment is only found in the rabbinic literature. The liturgy for Rosh Hashanah is replete with references to Abraham's faithfulness, and please that God will remember Abraham's action for our benefit. If you take a look at text number 4, this is simply one example from a High Holy Day liturgy. Our God and God of our ancestors, let us be remembered for good, and visit us with the visitation of salvation and merit from the heavens of old, and remember unto us, Lord our God, the covenant and the loving kindness and the oath you swore to Abraham our father on Mount Moriah, and the binding with which Abraham our father bound his son Isaac on the altar before you, how he suppressed his compassion in order to perform your will with a perfect heart. So may your compassion soften your anger against us. In your great goodness, may the fierceness of your wrath turn aside from your people, your city, and your inheritance. And indeed, even in the daily Jewish worship, 3 times a day, if one prays traditionally according to the Jewish practice, we recall the merit of Abraham in a text that we see in number 5. Blessed are you, O Lord our God and God of our fathers, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Some add God of Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. The great, mighty, and revered God, God most high, generous and kind, owner of all things. You remember the pious deeds of the patriarchs, and in love will bring a redeemer, some say redemption, to their children's children for your name's sake. O King, helper, savior, and shield, blessed are you, O Lord, the shield of Abraham. Some will add either the help of Sarah or who remembers Sarah from the daily liturgy. So, in conclusion, then, or almost in conclusion, because, I can never really conclude. In conclusion, then, the Jewish Abraham is significantly expanded from the Abraham found exclusively in the book of Genesis. In the words of John Levinson, which you also have here, in the Jewish tradition, Abraham is known as Avraham Avinu, our father Abraham. As the father of the Jewish people, he is not simply their biological progenitor, and as the tradition would have it, the father of all who have converted to Judaism as well. He is also the founder of Judaism itself, the first Jew, as it were, and the man whose life in some mysterious way pre-enacts the experience of the Jewish people, who are his descendants and who are to walk in the trails he blazed. The major way in which they are to do so is by serving and worshiping the God whom, according to the post-biblical but still authoritative traditions, Abraham rediscovered. So, do we share or do we not share Abraham? Again, I think what we're going to see is that there are some aspects of the Abraham that I have described that are unique to the Jewish tradition, even if there are other places where it overlaps with the Christian tradition or with the Muslim tradition. Abraham unites and Abraham divides, and it's in both this unity and this division, I think, that we really get to the substance and the most valuable aspects of these kinds of interreligious dialogues. So, thank you very much.
I knew David would go first, so all of my comments are directed towards David. I just want to give thanks to my colleagues and in good faith for allowing me this opportunity to speak tonight. And also, just it's good to see familiar faces that I've known over the years and also new faces. So I'm really pleased to be here and to share. I also, and I don't know if I just faded out of embarrassment, but I also am a graduate of CTU. In their master's, this is a plug for you, Scott, a master's in theology and interreligious dialogue here, which I received last spring, I believe. So, but I'm a pastor, a lowly pastor, and if you don't mind, I always start off any lecture or sermon with an anecdote. It calms me down and lowers your expectations. Right? I have worked as a Muslim relations coordinator for the Presbyterian of Chicago for almost 5 years. And in the course of working with churches and mosques, I ran into a Muslim gentleman who eventually became my friend, which is not, thankfully, a unique experience, I'm happy to say. At an event that I attended, he was speaking specifically about the Muslim love of Jesus and how this reverence could be built upon for common understanding and the common good between Christians and Muslims. And Christians came to these meetings often for the first time, to a mosque or masjid, to hear him talk about Jesus and Islam's reverence for him. And as we got to know each other better at a long, hospitable lunch, one that Abraham certainly could have given, he served me and he became very serious and asked me a poignant question. Jay, do you think that I know Jesus apart from you? And I sat there somewhat stunned, and I tried to think, which is always the Achilles heel for a Presbyterian, what he was getting at in his question. Yes, I think that you can know Jesus apart from me. Who am I? I replied. Isn't the sacred a somewhat equal opportunity employer, I reasoned, in which anyone can apply to participate? No, he continued again. Do you think that I can know Jesus apart from Christianity? And I thought even longer this time. I quickly rehearsed the horrible historical record of Christian relations with Muslims, of the Crusades and of colonialism, and the malaise of the Middle Eastern maneuvering, and I decided to trust my post-colonial instincts. And I said, no, I don't think you need Christianity to know Jesus, I replied. And he seemed very pleased with my answer, and through the months and years, we would participate, both of us, in conventions and speaking events that spoke about Jesus as a connector between Islam and Christianity. However, I realized that my yes to a big tent Jesus was heading into deeper waters. For every time I was introduced to speak by him, I was introduced as someone who followed Isa, son of Miriam. And whenever I broached titles or concepts such as Son of God, the cross, or specific gospel stories, I had the distinct feeling that I was not describing the right Jesus. Were we confusing other people in our good intentions? Were we theologically confused? In retrospect, I realized that this question regarding a joint claim to Jesus, or Isa, and its usability is much the same territory as our topic tonight regarding the figure of Abraham and the modern descriptor of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as the Abrahamic faiths. Do we all know Abraham and revere him in some way? The answer, I believe, is yes. But how far does this yes really get us? It reminds me of Jacob Neusner's book, Telling Tales, Making Sense of Christian and Judaic Nonsense, as he critiques the on-the-ground reality of the term Christian Judaic regarding a unified foundation for work between Christians and Jews. He called it one of the myths of our time. What did he mean? He meant that in reality, we understand our traditions in their deepest sense, in their thickest sense, and in their community identity forming sense as very unique and different. The term Judeo-Christian is a term that has come into common terminology in a post-Holocaust world, and in some ways as a response to it. It gives the impression that Judaism and Christianity are really quite similar in method, having the same goals, and the same religious means. I can remember the shock, and Michael Belinsky is here. He was the anonymous rabbi in this story. I can remember the shock at a recent Bible study at my church when the Christian flock realized that not only did Jews have a second Torah, the oral Torah, but that they arranged their scriptures in a different order, the order of the Tanakh, to teach, unbelievably, a different end, with Chronicles being the signifying end book rather than the Christian ending of Malachi. What do we give up by using terms like Christian Judaic or Abrahamic when referring to our respective and distinctive faiths? And what do we gain? What are we truly seeking to accomplish when we use these terms? Is it really theological after all? Now, Abraham is our patriarch of choice and host tonight, so if I may, let me give my own impression of how Abraham has been interpreted and represented in my upbringing. I was raised a conservative Baptist in a fundamentalist home that predated Mark Knoll's expose of evangelical American culture in the scandal of the evangelical mind. Abraham, in my upbringing, meant two things: the promise to the Jewish people, and thus continuity with them, and the evil of Roman Catholicism. Years later, in meeting John Polakowski and Scott, these warnings became suddenly very real to me. But let me back up a moment to set the context of how many evangelicals viewed Father Abraham. You see, Abraham in my upbringing was strongly tied to the Genesis narratives, and with it especially to the promise of a place and a peoplehood for Abraham's kin. Being raised within the bosom of a soft Christian Zionism, the Genesis narratives were oftentimes favored over New Testament portraits of Abraham. Abraham was Jewish. The promise was to the Jewish people, and from this foci flowed the rest of our theology. Now, those who know me must be thinking this explains his confused state of mind. Besides the patriarchal narrative, the passage in the New Testament that was quoted the most was from Galatians 3. That just as Abraham believed God, and it was attributed to him as righteousness, so those who believe are the descendants of Abraham. Yes, that's right. Abraham had believed first and had converted to God first by a simple act of faith, and not try to earn his way to heaven like those Roman Catholics down the street with their Oktoberfest and beer, of which I think I passed John as I drove here today. Abraham was very Protestant-like in God's enrollment of him by the low requirement bar of simple belief. In fact, I thought he sounded very Baptist. As humorous or as troubling as this trip down memory lane may have been for you all, it is important to acknowledge that all our theology, as Bob Schreider writes, is contextual to our environment. And this especially includes our home communities and families, where we are first taught our theology, or mitzvot, or sharia, all with lowercase letters. I was taught Abraham through the lens of pietistic Baptist fundamentalism, regardless of what the classical Christian tradition might have said in the history or theology books. It would be almost 25 years before I found myself talking to a Jewish person. And not too long after that, when I would find myself, to my grandfather's horror, graduating from a Roman Catholic institution. Because of this, even within my own journey, I have not known one Abraham, but many, through the diversity of Christian practice and my own personal growth. This was the seed of so-called Abrahamic thought in my life. But we're here to discuss our Abrahams here at our tables, not to hear a reed shaking in the wind. So let me lay out a few key images that have been significant for Christianity. The Apostle Paul makes much of Abraham in his social context of seeking to include Gentiles into the gathering of the ecclesia, or the church, of which he spent the latter part of his life. Could Gentiles be accepted in as converts to Judaism and worship the one God, or could they stand on their own, equal with their Jewish brothers and sisters as the final ingathering began? In seeking to find an answer and in finding one that would vilify Paul to many and shape Christianity until our day, Paul looks to the figure of Abraham in Genesis. Abraham is significant for Paul because the patriarch preceded the giving, this sounds funny now, David, he preceded the giving of the Mosaic law, which he felt to be hindering Gentile inclusion. Abraham was a prime example of an authoritative person from the sacred past who did not adhere to the written or oral law, and yet still was attributed as righteous because of his belief. He was the ultimate primeval ancestor of simple belief before the complexities that was Second Temple Judaism had ever arisen. Therefore, Paul could claim that allowing non-Torah observing Gentiles into the fold was really following what was true from the very beginning and planned for the very end. This was relevant to Paul because he sought to include Gentiles, and I know there is much debate over all of this, not as converts, but as co-heirs with Israel, by setting the bar of inclusion lower and by using Abraham as the example, because his faith in many ways was the same as the only thing that Gentiles could bring into the equation, which was their simple faith. Paul was radical in his thought and felt that Abraham was the father of all, in Romans, of many peoples, not just Jewish people or Gentile people, but specifically for any and all people who had faith. Not only this, but in an ingenious, some would say troubling, hermeneutical move, Paul states that the seed which is mentioned within the Genesis text does not refer to a people at all, but rather to a person, to the true seed, that is the Messiah. Interpreting Paul at a certain level of depth is comparable to doing Talmudic study or isnad authentication. It is dense and it is complex and contested. But let me sum this up simply by saying that Abraham for Paul, and thus for early Christianity, was the progenitor, the source of all people of faith, whether they be Jew, or more importantly for Paul and his mission, if they were Gentile. Daniel Boyarin has disparagingly called this type of Pauline interpretation as having the effect of disembodying a people, while Jeffrey Syker has traced the path of which had begun as an inclusive message for Gentiles into a message of disinheritance for the Jewish people in Christian history. After all, if all may be spiritually children of the promise, why bother or keep around the children of the flesh? Tragically, the church later and through time would expand these views to claim Abraham as one who excluded carnal Israel and rabbinic Jews from the promises of the one God, who had really come to the pre-Jewish Abraham and the post-Jewish Christian church. I think most Jews would agree, David, that the Abraham given expression here is different from the one explained by your rabbi regarding Beshrit, and especially from the wisdom of the oral Torah and the Midrashim. Suddenly, the criticism of Jacob Neusner and the question of the appropriateness of the ties that bind, and in this case, the tie of Abraham, between our traditions, regains its vigor. To even this out, within the New Testament, Abraham is very central and an authority for the early Messianic sect. He is appealed to at different levels of the Christian witness. He is described by the writer of the Hebrews as the one who, by faith, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. A very important characteristic for those following a scandalous, unknown way headed by one who was crucified. Abraham is seen again as a main representative figure in the afterlife by Jesus in his parable of the rich man and Lazarus in the Gospel of Luke, who after meeting a rich man post-mortem rejects his pleas to send a messenger back to the living world to warn others of the judgment by saying, if they did not listen to Moses or the prophets, they will not be persuaded even if someone raises from the dead. Again, a story with great polemical rhetoric for the day. Abraham is present at the eschaton and the consummation of history, where people will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and is present among those who come to speak with Jesus from the heavens in the story of Christ's transfiguration. He is also called a friend of God in the Epistle of James. Abraham is surely of great importance to the New Testament and those who lived it. The problem seems to be that although the New Testament certainly knows the figure of Abraham, much of the use of this patriarch finds its home in the scriptural polemics and arguments regarding which form of Judaism to be authentic and true. For the writers of the Christian scriptures to claim Abraham had great reward, as it connected the struggling sect to an ancient and foundational story. But to those outside this growing sect, this use of the patriarch was viewed as a form of identity theft in its weakest sense, and religious supersessionism in its most strong sense. In the Gospel of Luke, John the Baptist, the great eater of locusts, asked the scribes and Pharisees who had come to hear him speak whether they were seeking to avoid the coming wrath, and queries them as to whether they think that being a child of Abraham can save them. God can make these rocks into the children of Abraham, he retorts. This is not exactly the stuff of interfaith harmony. And in the Gospel of John, again in a story seeking to legitimate early Christians as children of Abraham, it is stated that Abraham, in fact, longed for the day to see the Messiah, Jesus. In fact, before Abraham was, Jesus states, I am. These traditions have painful historical consequences in the Jewish-Christian encounter through the ages. Who is Abraham to me? To Christians, certainly a model of faith and faithfulness, one who was given the promises of God ensured by a covenant, one whom Jesus and early Christians sought to call Father and forebearer of peoples. A crucial link of continuity for Christianity with its Jewish roots. However, for some Jewish friends and colleagues, and I would think most, these traditions could be argued to have helped pave the way and come to their painful fruition in the incinerators of Auschwitz and Treblinka. So do Jews, Christians, and Muslims worship the same God? I would say we would all affirm this in one way or another. Is Abraham one who is revered in our respective traditions? Certainly so. But are we together, the Abrahamic traditions, united by the same Abraham, of which we all know similarly, as was asked of me by my Muslim friend regarding Jesus? And perhaps we should pause. There are many scholars, John Levinson among them, that deconstruct the image of a shared, continuous faith in the three separate traditions. Abraham is known very differently according to the Jewish and Islamic traditions. I seek in vain to find Abraham as the discoverer of monotheism in the New Testament and find no mention of his building project with Ishmael of the Holy Kaaba. The irony is, in our interconnected interfaith world, I many times teach things about Abraham as Christian truth, when in fact the stories that inform me are not from a Christian source. Theologian Aaron Hughes, writing a searing critique of the term Abrahamic religions in his book, Abrahamic Religions on the Uses and Abuse of History, states that Abraham, ironically, was a term to divide and to exclude for the last several hundred years, rather than to include, as I demonstrated by my own upbringing regarding Roman Catholics and Protestants. Just as the term Judeo-Christian appeared after the flames of the Holocaust had physically subsided, so the term Abrahamic religions has risen to prominence specifically out of the need for Islamic, Christian, and I would say Jewish, understanding after the outrage and tragedy that was 9/11. Most scholars advise extreme caution with the term Abrahamic religions and see it as the interreligious arena leaking into the academic and sacred one. But even so, we must ask ourselves, what are we truly seeking when we gather around the personage of Abraham? Is it really theological? Or as Martin Luther King Jr. might have said, is it not out of the necessity of survival for our children and our grandchildren in a world that seems to teeter dangerously toward the edge on many days? We live in a day where the quest for some sort of unitive religious pluralism is waning, and when the desire for global religion, in which all religions are in some way but one shard of a large diamond, has given way to the importance of our differences. and of the different details that make our traditions strong and life-giving in our home communities. The historical Abraham, and we could argue this into the wee hours of the night, is hidden in the midst of time and in the fragility of the historical critical project. The Abrahams that we are given in our separate sacred scriptures are voices and witnesses to very unique and different religious communities. These Abrahams and other biblical figures witness to their own respective flocks and faith commitments. They speak and preach a common language to those raised to hear them. Now, we can seek to dodge this reality or to discern deeper and to seek deeper another reason why perhaps we are called to come together under any name. Why was it okay for me to say that Jesus, the Son of God, and Esau, the son of Miriam, were the same person? In retrospect, I don't think what drove my response was a theological one, but rather because the need for reconciliation between Christians and Muslims is great in our day. And by sharing that which I love so greatly, Jesus for me, and by allowing others to tell new stories of family members now loved in a different light, Esau, much as Abraham is this evening, we are doing much the same action as when Pope John Paul lifted high the Quran and kissed it for the world to see. It is an action of reverence to the other tradition and a sign of hope to the world. Yes, we should gather as Abrahamic religions, as monotheistic religions, or Mosaic religions, or biblical religions, only because in our place in the world, in this country, we have work to do. And we are realizing that our faith demands our participation in not just our politics. One would hope other fuzzy associations would be created in other parts of the world where inaccurate academic categories like the Indian religions of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Sikhism, or the North American religions of descent, native descent and non-native descent would begin to form. These titles and descriptors might be rather shaky, almost humorously so. Yet it certainly cannot be argued that peace and reconciliation is not needed in these areas and that our religions must become attuned to these commitments. Yes, we are different traditions. Yes, we have different stories, different interpretations of familiar people. But for some reason, God has given us a place to tell them in the hope of learning other meanings and uses for them for a more peaceful world. If God had wanted one seal-tight description of Abraham, God certainly could have done the job. Let us embrace the need to see our differences and seek a religious pluralism that is not naive and unaware to the diversity that marks us. For in our wrestling and scriptural reasoning, we surely will find desperately needed fruit and strong trees that can give hospitality to all who come. After all, as the Apostle Paul says in his letters to those living in Rome, the God whom Abraham knew is the God who calls things into being which are not yet, who knows what may be found which does not exist today, that may and must exist tomorrow. Perhaps the desire for this gift is one legacy of Abraham for our time. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I want to begin by thanking my newfound colleague and friend, Scott Alexander, for inviting me this evening, but I also want to provide a little bit of a disclaimer for him. We only met a couple months ago, and he really doesn't know me that well. And so this evening, I find myself in a very welcoming but unique position. I am a professor of Islamic history by training. I come from an academic background in the Department of Religious Studies from Emory University. And it's sort of our MO in the academy to always speak in the third person about religion, right? And I'm sure that many folks here are familiar with that routine, right? Is sort of in the classroom in the public university, I say, Muslims believe such and such, but never can I say I, all right? My students are desperately dying to know, why I'm a Muslim, how I'm a Muslim, my own background, and I can't really have that conversation. So over the last couple of years, I've found myself increasingly in spaces like this, where I am able to speak with that sort of voice. And tonight is probably the first time that I'm able to really fully do that, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to do that. I did have the opportunity to teach at Candler School of Theology for a couple of semesters, and that was a significantly different kind of space than the Department of Religion at Emory University or the kind of department that I'm in now. So this evening I'm going to be sharing with you some reflections, both personal and academic, and thirdly, of course, theological. I was asked to speak about the topic of Abraham this evening. I won't do so as a religious leader. I'm not qualified as a religious leader as such, but I do participate in a number of organizations and community efforts. And so I'll speak to you this evening as a scholar with some background, and also as a person who has been deeply influenced by both developments within my own religious community and with developments in the academic disciplines over the last 10 years. And so let me start then on a personal note. I come from a pretty unique background. It's not unique if you're from southern Los Angeles. It is a Persian and Chicano background. All right. And so there happens to be a few dozen folks that I've met with that same pedigree. My mother is from northern New Mexico and from small villages up by the Taos Santa Fe area, and we're actually descendants of early Spanish conquistadores, right? And so even in that community, we're something. Even when I call myself Hispanic or Latino or Chicano, I have to qualify it with this unique background. My father is from Iran, and in the wider Muslim world, as you know, Iranians are Shiites, and they come from a Shiite background. So my sort of existence in the Muslim community also has to be nuanced with this sort of background. And to top it all off, my mother coming from really a Pentecostal background, and my father's family being a devoutly Shiite, family, I think both had quite enough with sort of active religion growing up. And so I was raised in a family where God was always present, but never really in any kind of institutional way. And so for most Muslims, who are raised in the United States, to hear this sentence is kind of profound. If it was Ramadan, I didn't know that it was Ramadan, right? And so I was raised that way until I went to college. And so when I started practicing Islam, I really experienced the practice of Islam as a convert, right? And so the conversion experience is one that I deeply, that resonates with me. And so in those years of college, like many of us go through, you're always trying to sort of find one's identity, one's mission in life and whatnot. And I found myself really attracted to this conversation that was taking place amongst the sort of multicultural left at the University of Colorado at Boulder, which is something of a mini Berkeley campus, a long history of social activism, social justice. And I was really drawn into that conversation and found myself quickly as a major of African American studies. And that was at that time in the Department of Ethnic Studies there. And then it's after that moment that I start practicing Islam. And it's right at that moment that the second Intifada begins, right, in the year 2000. And so, things move quickly in the vacuous, in an environment of vacuous leadership in student unions. And so all of a sudden, I'm involved at high levels of the Muslim Student Association and the Coalition for Justice in Palestine. And we're all supporting in solidarity with the other groups and their efforts towards their different campaigns. And all of a sudden 9/11 happens, right? And so we're hit with 9/11. And I'm faced with something that I've observed historically, and I've kind of thought about in an abstract sense historically, and that was at the same time that women in our Muslim Student Association were being harassed for wearing the hijab, some of them being spit on. Literally the exact same day, flowers are being left at our doorstep, from the Christian Student Union or from the Baptist Student Union, and we're being invited for dinner. At the very same time that we're trying to convince people to stay in the country instead of return back to Kuwait or return back to Saudi Arabia or return back to Egypt where, they're here studying abroad. And so this dualism has really captivated me in the last 10 years. And just by matter of observation, I've sort of turned one corner of my research portfolio into, the study of Islam in America, and I've really acutely observed what interfaith activity has been for the Muslim community in the United States. And again, I've been a fly on the wall for most of this, and I come to you tonight really as, again, disclaimer for Scott here, as somebody who is in loyal opposition, all right? And that's somebody who's going to bring, a kind of critical voice or a contextual voice to what's been going on in the last 10 years, as far as I can tell, with the interfaith movement as it relates to the Muslim community in the United States. But I do so in absolute solidarity. And so if my biting Persian cynicism comes out, just know that it's in a friendly fashion. So what has really the interfaith and Abrahamic conversation meant for Muslims in the United States? Well, right before 9/11, the dominant tone of voice in the American Muslim community, at least through its institutions and through its leadership, especially at the minbar or the pulpit, the dominant voice was really one that I wouldn't call Abrahamic, but I would call it Adamic, from Adam. The notion was that Islam was being brought to the United States with a mission to bring the religion to the country, to spread it. There is a strong evangelical strain within Islamic tradition. Most of the leadership was invested in sort of spreading the message of Islam in order to really bring out the best of America and the best of Islam. This wasn't necessarily a hostile move, but the general tempo was that Islam is going to help America. Now, this was something that the various communities of Muslims in the United States agreed upon, both the immigrants, the newly arrived, the second generation, and this was decidedly the case with the African American sort of tone of voice with Islam. I mean, Islam was a salvific and redemptive and rehabilitative program in the African American Muslim experience. And so that, again, was pretty much the standard until September 11th. And so immediately afterwards, with the profound sort of anti-Muslim anxiety, discrimination, acts of violence, paranoia, which I shouldn't say is absolutely dominant, because again, we were dealing with this dual track of anxiety and reaching out. And we saw the best and worst of America, and we still are in that sense. Tonight is part of that. But interfaith and the conversation of Abrahamic for Muslims in America since 9/11 has really been a place of refuge. It has been a place where civic actors across the faith line have actually been able to engage with the Muslim community at a time when the Muslim community feels absolutely alienated in this country. And so it's been absolutely a refuge. It's been great. And those people that were invested in that conversation prior to 9/11 really jumped ahead in the institutional leadership of Muslim communities in the United States after September 11th. These people now became the ambassadors for the mosques. And again, it was a refuge. It was a platform really for citizenship. It's through forums such as this one, such as the Islamic Speakers Bureau in Atlanta, which is one franchise of a larger organization across the country. It's through organizations like that that Muslims get to be ambassadors and citizens for their own faith and attend again, a number of different institutions, civic engagements, even engage the political platform a little bit. And it's been really a positive thing. And it has also been a very strong lever against those elements within the community that were more strident, that were not conducive to the idea of sort of a reconciliation with America, those elements of the community that were very vocal about evangelical work and whatnot. This interfaith opportunity created a leverage of power against those elements within the Muslim community. And it also allowed for a sort of American religious identity to emerge in a way that sort of captures what this whole Abrahamic notion is about. You often find now Muslims talking about, in an abstract sense, well, what really is a Muslim? Capital M, lowercase m, and Abraham, of course, with the low barrier of standard of inclusiveness of piety. All you have to do is believe. If you believe in goodness, if you submit to that goodness, then you're a Muslim. And so for Muslims, this was a very attractive kind of idiom to enter the public sphere, and it's been great. But as Levinson points out in the book, and actually I brought this book just so I could quote it, if you don't mind. I thought this was a profound line. You know, in post 9/11 America, where both America's trying to search for itself and make sure that those elements of hate and xenophobia that are really a hallmark of this country's legacy, that they don't get too strong. America was in need to build a community. They did so through Abraham. The Muslims are in need to be part of this community. They do so through Abraham. But Levinson points out something quite profound. He says, all of this bears in a very direct but insufficiently noticed way upon the claim of many today that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam constitute an Abrahamic family of religions. Only if communal membership is irrelevant to Abrahamic identity, only, that is, if membership in any of the three communities is equivalent to membership in the other two, could the claim be sustained? And the answer there is obviously no, that it's a paradox. That even as we invoke Abraham as the central figure for all of us, as everybody I think now clearly realizes, that the paradox is that there is no one such community. And instead, it's a legacy of a relational community with one another. And Abraham, for the most part, like Daniel Boyer and others pointed out, has always been a history of antagonism, a history of polemics. And so now Muslims are faced, and I think other members of the faith community are faced with this paradox that we've arrived at an understanding that we have a need for community building, and Abraham is that vehicle, but that very vehicle that brings us together is also the vehicle that can break us apart. And so what is it really about community that we need to think about? And what is it the community that Abraham might be able to foster for us? Again, I'll just reiterate that in the history of Islam, just as the relationship between Judaism and Christianity existed in a supersessionist fashion, where Christian doctrine reinterprets the Hebrew scriptures for its own end and culminates in a history of a rather dark history, so too does Muslim theology supersede Judeo and Christian tradition. And so Abraham, just like Moses, just like Jesus, exists in Islamic tradition for a dual purpose: to lay claim to an ancient primordial orthodoxy of Islam, but also to do a power play upon the traditions that came before. Now, that was the dominant paradigm in the sort of imperial form of Islam, which was, for the most part, has been historically the Sunni tradition. And in the Shiite tradition, scholars have quibbled historically about sort of doctrinal issues regarding Abraham's faith. When he deduces monotheism, was he actually questioning it or not? Did he ever have doubt? And they have some doctrinal nuances that Shiites have to work out. And even there, where they are arguing with their Sunni counterparts, Abraham is a kind of political football, kind of polemical and political football. So this brings me to sort of the modern moment and thinking about how we have reconstructed a notion of Abraham as a potential for a community building today. And I think about how it's uniquely related to a post-9/11 dynamic, especially for Muslim communities. And then I think back about how it is that communities always invoke a very particularistic memory for their own political ends, and how those images and those memories are shaped to suit certain needs. And I'd like to bring up perhaps a figure that many of us might not know about, that offers a unique sort of rift on Abraham and might lead us out of the impasse that I think that we're at with the paradox of Abrahamic community. And that is a figure known as Ali Shariati. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with Ali Shariati. Ali Shariati is known as really one of the chief intellectual architects of the Iranian Revolution prior to its sort of dominance by the forms and the forces that you find today. But in the 1970s, Ali Shariati's lectures captivated the youth of Iran, but he had gotten his training really in the 60s while he was in France, where he was participating as a writer with the FLN and the Algerian resistance to French colonialism. And Ali Shariati is somebody now who is engaging with all of the major anti-colonial intellectual movements taking place in Europe. He gets injured at a rally after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. He is an interlocutor with Frantz Fanon, talking about the role of religion in the social movement, in anti-colonial revolution. And for all of the transcendental and sort of abstract symbolic language Ali Shariati employed when it came to religion, Ali Shariati's politics were always concrete. They were always directly attached to a movement, to a campaign, to an issue that had a direct result. And I wonder about that with the Abrahamic initiative. What really is its telos? What really is its agenda? If it's not concretized, then the myth-making has no real utility. Shariati understood what he was doing. So Ali Shariati, the son of a religiously learned family, his own father had sort of steered away from a traditional religious family and gone more towards sort of intellectual cosmopolitan work. Ali Shariati continues that tradition, gets a PhD in what would be the equivalent of philology or Islamic studies, something similar to what I received my degree in. But he goes back to Iran and constructs an elaborate philosophy of the role of Islam as an anti-colonial liberation movement, and some people will call it Islamic political theology. Okay. Now, for Ali Shariati, the prophets are real and they have a mission, but their message is not dogmatic. Their message is not concerned ritual and doctrine, but rather their message is a continuous message from the time of Abraham all the way to Muhammad, and then continues through to Hussein, and that's the Shiite spin on it. All right? And that mission is really to bring justice to the world. And so those paradigms and those pillars of Islamic faith that we know as Tawheed, oneness, shirk, idolatry, Shariati reads all of that back into the history of the prophets, not as a moment of faith and belief only, okay, but a moment of practice, a moment of action. When he separates himself from when Abraham separates from his father, or in Islamic tradition, in Shiite tradition they believe it's his uncle that he's arguing with, and there's reasons for that. I'll go into them later if you like. But when he breaks the idols and he argues with his family, he's severing community, and he's doing so in an action-based fashion. He's speaking truth to power, truth to justice, in an action-based format. And for Shariati, the symbol there is the hammer in the hand as the idol breaker, and not necessarily just the obedient and blind kind of, faith-oriented Abraham. And I think that that's something that Shariati really harps upon as being symbolic of the entire mission of world religions. So Shariati develops a concept now where he critiques all institutional religion. He still has this residue of socialism, Marxism, where he fears outright that religion can be a false flag, an opiate of the masses. And he wants to make religion be an action-based platform. He doesn't want it to be a faith-based platform only. And so Shariati and his reconstruction of biblical myth and prophetic myth, he cites Abraham's conversation with Nimrod over the sovereignty of God as a moment of a declaration of the freedom from man, a protest against governmentality, most immediately for Shariati in the anti-imperial sense, but also in the anti-dictatorial sense of the Shah. Right? And it's that moment of concretizing the Abrahamic mission that I think Shariati was able to bring to the table and make religion a viable force in the modern conversation for human equality. And it wasn't simply a non-theological argument. Religion was something for Shariati that had immense social power, immense political power, and he wanted to maintain that conversation in the midst of political action. And so, again, I think that Shariati's platform might inform us a little bit about the impasse that we're in. And I'll just share some thoughts as I wrap this up. I'll share some thoughts about a conversation we had last night and how I think the Abrahamic conversation parallels a conversation about civil rights in this country. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, and you saw that we celebrated quite profoundly in this country 50th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech. Well, I had a colleague and friend come and deliver a speech last night at an event that we called After Malcolm, Islam and the Black Freedom Struggle. This is a professor named Sohel Dalatzai, who wrote a book called Black Star Crescent Moon about the interactions of black radical thought and its internationalization and its encounter with global anti-colonialism. And the conversation was really about the framework of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, as you know, in this country, provides a profound sense of triumph and identity for some accomplishments and some achieving that took place. However, it also constrains the conversation in a certain way. Civil rights, for many, have not been fully realized because the conversation was much more than rights to a ballot box. It was much more than desegregation. It was about fighting the violence of white supremacy that pervades tax structures, property taxes, school distribution of funds for schools, socioeconomic institutionalized racism. That's what the conversation was really about for those who were unsatisfied with the outcome of the civil rights movement. And so the conversation last night was really meant to be an intervention in what will become next year even a more profound celebration of civil rights at a time when the country is extremely polarized, right? Where socioeconomic inequality still persists and where the racial divide exists in some kind of schizophrenia. We have attempts at a post-racial America, and the election of President Obama somehow has sort of made that a reality for some people, but the very structures that people were fighting for 50 years ago are still resonating quite deeply. And so I make that parallel to the notion of Abrahamic because I believe that the framework of Abrahamic provides a similar set of challenges and opportunities. It does limit our conversation in a certain way, like all community might, but it also enables and provides opportunities for collectivity. And if we are really at an interfaith community at a consensus point where we understand that our differences do matter and we are not going to simply level out those differences and say that we're one religion, well then what is the basis of the Abrahamic community after that, besides simple tolerance? Because frankly, I doubt that any of us would have ever disagreed or been intolerant with one another, had we been outside of this context. Really, this is a community that is forming to say, we are not that other that is bad. We are the good ones. Right? Now, we've all come together on some kind of action, but it is not really, if you look at it and think about Shariati's claim that all these movements have to be concretized, it is not the case that the world's religious differences are over doctrinal issues. We don't need the anecdote of Abraham to get us over differences in doctrine. We need Abraham to think about justice. We need Abraham to think about action. Most of the world's problems in religious, intolerance stem from concrete, profound injustice. All right? Concrete, profound relationships of power. And if we're going to mobilize the patriarch of humanity, all right, we have to do so in a way that is conscious of those realities. And it's not my place in any way to determine what that platform might be, but I will say that if Abraham's covenant is a sign of fessing up and owning up to the most difficult calls, well then introspection and hard, difficult ethical questions about what we do with interfaith movements, all right, at a time of profound injustice in some parts of the world. That ethical conversation is a hard one, but it's definitely not as hard as binding your son. And so I want to speak concretely here, just to raise certain issues. For example, we all know that it is absolutely necessary for us to sit down at the table as Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and perhaps go on shared pilgrimage sites together. But we also understand the concrete reality of what it takes to dismantle an apartheid system. Now, if we're not willing to have that kind of conversation, all right, or even come to terms with defining that kind of conversation, well then, again, we might be in a sort of non-teleological, aimless sort of Abrahamic myth-making. And so I raise that just as, again, somebody that's in absolute solidarity, loyal opposition, but I think that these are conversations that need to be had and need to be concretized. And if we're already in that place, where we know that we need to take the next step, well then inshallah, God willing, we'll be able to do that in part this evening. Thank you very much.